I'll bring you some books back. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce our speaker here, Larry Bothe. Larry is an FAA-designated pilot examiner with the Indianapolis FSDO. He's a Gold SEAL and master flight instructor with 8,000 hours flight experience, flown more than 90 types of aircraft. He's rated in airplanes, land and sea, helicopters, gliders, owned 4 airplanes, and currently flies an Aeronica Champ. Can we have a round of applause for Larry Bothe?
Okay, thank you for the fine introduction here. We'll get started. I want to know, why are you working so hard to fly your airplane and spending so much money? In 44 years of flying, I've learned some tips and tricks about how to fly easier and spend less. And that's what I want to share with you here today. They already told you all about me. The only thing I'll mention that they didn't say is that in addition to being a pilot and an instructor, I've also managed an FBO and rented airplanes and been responsible for the maintenance of them. And I was also an officer in a fairly big flying club in the Chicago area for a while. So I've been in this at the management level in addition to just the pilot level. When I do check rides or flight reviews, I often see pilots working really, really hard to fly the airplane, just to get relatively simple tasks accomplished. And so I want to tell you how to do some things the easy way. And I think that sometimes flight instructors don't tell pilots, don't tell their students everything they know. It's like they're making students pay their dues by not telling them these little secrets. They teach them the hard way first, and then maybe they don't ever tell them the easy way, or they learn it later. I think we ought to start out flying the easy way. I think this in part influences the horrible dropout rate that we have. There's like, when people start taking flying lessons, only about 30% ever complete them. There's like a 70% dropout rate. Why? I think partly because they're finding out, hey, this isn't as much fun as I thought. I'm having to work really hard to get this done. It's difficult. Well, maybe it's not as difficult as it looks. I want to talk about that. Hopefully, my presentation will generate a few questions. I'd like you to hold it till the end, though, to make sure I get through everything I want to tell you in the allotted time, and I think I will. I've done this presentation twice before, and the formal part doesn't quite fill an hour, so we'll have time to talk. So we'll answer questions at the end, and I'll also have my contact information up on the screen at the end, so if any of you want to ask me something later, send me an email. You can do that. I respond well to email. So here we go. 21 things that will make your flying easier, safer, cheaper, and a whole lot more fun. First, I want to talk about trim. You can make the airplane do a lot of your work for you if you know how to interface correctly with the airframe. First of all, first thing you have to do is take off, right? So there's, on your trim control, there's a mark for where you're supposed to set the trim for takeoff. Okay? And I have a picture of a Cessna here. And you notice that this trim indicator is the indicator parts set down by the word O in off. It's not set right at the little caret where Cessna is suggesting you put it. Well, I'm sure when it left the factory, setting it on that little caret was perfect. But what happens is, systems wear over time. This is a 1981 Cessna. And especially if you just have 2 people in the front seat, it needs a little more nose-up trim. If you have people in the back, then there's weight back there. You don't need as much trim. So here's what I'm suggesting to you if you'd like to do less work. So you take off in the airplane that you normally fly and pitch for whatever airspeed you'd like to climb at, perhaps 80 knots in a Skyhawk. Then set the trim so you're not pushing or pulling. Now, look down at the trim indicator and find out where the indicator is. In our airplane with 2 people in it, it's right by that O and the word off. Remember that. The next time you go to take off in the airplane, set it there. Take off. As soon as you get airborne and the airplane accelerates a little bit, you know what? It just settles into an 80-knot climb, and you don't have to fuss with the trim. Much easier. You're not fiddling with things. You can be looking for traffic. So that's one thing. I should probably save this for the end because it happens to be the number one thing where I see people working really, really hard, but I'll share it with you right now in case you need to get up and go to lunch or something. Okay. Doing level offs. When people climb to their chosen altitude, perhaps 3,000 feet, as they approach 3,000 feet, they don't even wait till they get there. They can't wait to start reducing the power. Like, it'll be horrible if they would go through 3,000 feet. And then they get to 3,000 feet, the power's already come back, and they lower the nose somewhat. People can't bring themselves to lower the nose all the way to level flight. Even you know what that looks like, they just won't do it. I don't understand why, but they don't. And then what happens is the airplane starts to accelerate. So they set the trim a little. The airplane accelerates. Okay, it gets up to 90 knots. Oh, more lift. Starts to climb again. Now, I'll lower the nose. So they lower the nose. Then the RPM picks up because the propeller disc unloads. And instead of turning 2,300, suddenly they're turning 24. They go, oh, rats, I didn't want that much power. And they retard the throttle 100 RPM. Now the airplane descends. And then they go, oh, phooey. Okay, so to make a long story short, for 2 or 3 minutes while they're fiddling with pitch power trim, they're going through the air like a porpoise, like this. And finally, they get it leveled out. And it literally takes 2 or 3 minutes. Here's how to do it in 10 or 15 seconds. You're climbing at full throttle. You're trimmed for an 80-knot climb in my example. When you get to the altitude, the final altitude you have chosen, don't do anything. Don't retard the throttle. Don't lower the nose. Fly through it 50 feet. When you get, in my example, to 3,050 feet, lower the nose all the way to level flight. And use your left hand to hold it there. It requires forward pressure on the wheel. While your left hand is holding the forward pressure, reach down with your right hand to your trim control. In a Skyhawk, you reach to the bottom of that trim wheel that sticks out of the console and grab it with your fingers and move it from where it comes out all the way to the top. That's a big, gross trim adjustment. If you're flying a Piper Warrior and that little wheel's between the seats, just give it 2 rolls of trim forward. You can figure out what it is for whatever airplane you fly, but what you're trying to do is relieve most of the forward trim pressure. Now, keep in mind, you haven't reduced the throttle, right? But you lowered the nose to level flight. So now, immediately, it accelerates to cruise speed. 8 or 10 seconds. Part of the time, by the time you can do the trim change, it's already up to cruise speed. Once it reaches cruise speed, retard the throttle to your chosen cruise RPM. You're probably essentially done right there. In a Skyhawk, 1 roll of trim sets it. But depending how you're loaded, whether you half tanks, full tanks, 1 person in the back, nobody in the back, you might have to fine-tune the trim a little bit. So you make a little small trim adjustment, and the airplane's in level cruise flight in 10 to 15 seconds instead of 2 or 3 minutes. Then, when you have an opportunity, of course, clean the mixture so you don't waste fuel and so that you can be kind to your engine, because your engine doesn't want to run rich. Okay, so that's the number one thing. Nobody got up and left. Okay. How about a cruise descent? How do you descend and level off? Can you make the airplane do that for you? Sure you can. In a fixed pitch propeller airplane, just try pulling 300 RPM off and let the nose seek its own attitude. In a constant speed propeller airplane, try 3 inches of manifold pressure. But don't touch the trim. The thing's already trimmed for cruise flight, and you're going to want to return to cruise flight, so if you don't monkey with the trim, you don't have to retrim the airplane. Let it descend to whatever altitude you would like. Well, you can't descend all the way to the bottom because you'll go through it, right? Yeah. So while you're descending, take a look at your rate of climb. Say you're descending 600 feet a minute. Take 10%. In this example, that would be 60 feet. When you get within 60 feet of your ending desired altitude, just bring the power back up promptly. Don't straight arm it, but just bring it back up that 300 RPM that you pulled off. Nose comes up by itself. Don't pull on the control wheel. Just bringing the power up will cause the airplane to level off. It's like it had autopilot with altitude capture. It works perfectly. Airplane will level off all by itself. You don't have to retrim because you didn't change the trim. Then finally, if you've descended significantly, you'll need to enrich in the mixture because you don't want to starve the engine. It's not necessary, incidentally, to enrich in the mixture when you first started descending, because certainly at all that significant power reduction, you're not going to burn any valves on the way down, right? Okay. How about trim for best glide? How many people here, by the way, have ever had an engine failure? Raise your hand. I'm curious. How many engine failures? About 10 or 15% of the crowd have had an engine fail. I've had a few of them. It gets your attention, and what do? You need to trim for best glide, right? First, you need to pitch for best glide, excuse me, and then in order to get the airplane to continue to fly at best glide, you need to set the trim. If you don't set the trim, your hand won't remember to hold that back pressure, and pretty soon you find yourself going much faster than best glide and losing altitude at an alarming rate. So how much do you trim? Well, most people, they hold back pressure, move the trim a little bit, and then they test. They kind of relax. Nose still drops. They trim it some more. Nose still drops. They're fiddling with this trim and testing, fiddle, test, when they ought to be doing something else, but they're not. They're messing with a trim. How you get out of all that? You just trim full nose up. I'm listening for groans. I usually get some groans from the audience when I say that, because people think it'll do a trim stall. You trim a full nose up, it'll stall. This guy's nodding his head, yes. No, it won't. It's a certification requirement that the airplane not stall, power off, full nose up trim. And most light general aviation airplanes will fly very close to best glide, full nose up trim. So rather than fiddle with it, if you need best glide, just trim the full nose up without stopping till the trim wheel stops moving. Then see what it does. The Skyhawk that we fly at home, whether we ran out, flies at 63 knots. Best glide per the POH is 65 knots. And you know what? With only 2 people in it, we're a little light. Best glide probably really is 63 at that weight. So that really works. Then, once you set the trim, then you can attend to all the other things you ought to be doing in an engine failure. Declaring an emergency, getting some help, maneuvering the airplane to land, and so forth and so on. Get on with the things that will save your life. Let the trim fly the airplane. The only thing you do have to be careful, by the way, is that if you trim full nose up, say to try it or practice it, when you bring the power back up to recover from that, the airplane will pitch up substantially. So you have to know that and hold some forward pressure till you reset the trim. Let's do mixture and throttle. Less work here will save some money. when should you lean the mixture? The reason I'm asking that question is I find that many instructors will tell people, well, you know, you don't need to lean the mixture below 3,000 feet. Or some people pick 5,000 feet. If you're below that, just leave it full rich. And you know what? That's not what the engine manufacturers say. Engine manufacturers say you should lean the mixture anytime you're in level cruise flight, regardless of altitude. And that's true, you should. So all this baloney about don't lean below 3,000 or whatever other altitude comes to mind is just that, baloney. Leaning the mixture saves you a lot of money. And if you don't lean the mixture, you know that cruise performance chart in your pilot's operating handbook? You can tear that page out and stuff it out that little vent window, because all that fuel consumption data in that chart is completely erroneous. Airplanes burn about 15 to 20 more % fuel if you don't lean. So if it says that your Skyhawk burns 7.6 gallons an hour, at the top the chart says with recommended lean mixture in little fine print in the notes. You know what it burns if you don't lean it? 9 gallons an hour. Our Skyhawk has fuel flow in it because the owner added it. And so it's really easy to demonstrate that to people if you have a fuel flow meter. Okay, so lean the mixture when you're in level cruise flight. How about keeping your spark plugs clean? Save you some money on maintenance. After you get the engine started, you're going to taxi out to where you're going to do the run-up. And at our airport, it's an old World War II field. We don't have much traffic, but boy, do we have a lot of real estate. It's easy to have to taxi a mile over to the runway. All that time you're taxiing, your spark plugs are getting crapped up if you leave the mixture full rich. So how much should you lean the engine? Well, you can soon figure that out yourself. After you get it started and it's running smoothly, you can screw the mixture control out, and you can lean it until the engine falters, then screw it back in until it runs smoothly, and then you can observe how far out is the mixture. For almost all airplanes, it ends up being 2 fingers width. And Cessna teaches this at the factory. I had the pleasure of picking up a brand new Cessna and doing a transition course out in Independence, Kansas a few years ago, and they actually teach it. And I think in the absolutely newest ones, the POH says it now, but when I was there in 2007, more than a few years, 2007, they were teaching it, but it was not yet in the POH. But figure out where your engine wants to run at idle and lean it there. Next thing is, so first of all, what you're trying to do is keep the spark plugs from fouling and from lead plating out on your valve guides and making your valve guide stick. The other thing that really helps in the same vein is any time you stop the airplane, is physically sitting still, set the power between 1,000 and 1,200 RPM. Now, this doesn't apply to when it's in motion. If you're in motion taxiing and the airplane's going too fast, your first line of defense to control speed is to retard the throttle. But once you're stopped, then set the power between 1,000 and 1,200, then enter your waypoint in the GPS, put your bearing in the VOR, get your charts folded, make sure everybody's safety belts buckled, all the things that you needed to get ready for takeoff. Then, when you're truly ready for takeoff, you're going to do a gump check, right? Gas, undercarriage, mixture, prop, and if you put an S on the end, safety. And when you get around to the mixture, you go, I'll enrich in that mixture for takeoff. So you do want to go to full rich for takeoff to protect the engine from detonation. So don't forget that. So those 2 things will go a long way to keeping your plugs clean. What do you do if you get a bad mag check? You know, you bring it up to whatever RPM the manufacturer says. A lot of Lycomings are 1700 RPM. And you check the left and right mags, and one of them, the engine shakes and it misses. Okay, got a fouled plug here. You do what's called a burnout. You set the, it's important. Got to go back to both on the mags, go to both, bring the power up to 2000 RPM, and then lean the mixture. Start screwing out till it falters, screw it back in until it runs smoothly, look at your watch or your sweep second hand and clock in the airplane, and let it run that way for 20 seconds. Seems like forever. It's like waiting for water to boil. Long 20 seconds. But do it for 20 seconds, then fully enrich in the mix. Go back to full rich, set the power back to the run-up RPM, and check your mags. 9 times out of 10, the roughness is gone. Why? Okay, what you did was you brought the temperature of combustion up, and you burnt the plated out lead off the plugs. Turned it into ash, it went out the exhaust pipes, and now you're good to go. Last line of defense, if you check it and they still miss, you can do the same thing at full throttle. Bring it up to full throttle, lean it, run it for 20 seconds, and try it again. If your one mag is still rough, take it to the shop and get the mechanic to help you out. But that's how you do a burnout. How about a warm engine start? We all know if it's cold, hasn't been run today, it's going to need a couple shots of prime. The colder out it is, the more prime you're going to need. Okay? That's fine. And if you shut it down just long enough to load or unload a passenger, probably won't need any prime to get it started again. But what if you go someplace and you land and you go in a restaurant for lunch, come back out 45 minutes or an hour later, and the engine's still warm, but it's not hot? Okay, well maybe you could prime it, but one thing that really works neat, quick, efficient is to do a two-handed start. So when you're ready to start the engine, turn on the master, one hand on the key probably to start, put your other hand on the throttle. Turn the key over to start so the propeller starts to turn. When the propeller starts to turn, briskly advance the throttle all the way in, pull it all the way back into the stop, all the way back out to the stop, and then back in a 1/4 inch. And you know what? The engine will start as you're pulling the throttle back out. But that's okay. Don't stop your hand there, because you'll be at half throttle and will start with a heck of a roar. You don't want that. Now pull it all the way back out to the stop and push it back in a 1/4 inch, and it'll be running. And in this particular instance, you want to move the throttle pretty fast, like in, out, 1/4 inch at that cadence. Now, you would not advance the throttle that fast for takeoff, right? And you also wouldn't retard it that fast to create a descent. It's not good for the engine. But in this case, you're just trying to exercise the accelerator pump in the carburetor so it squirts a little extra gas. It's important that the propeller be turning. You should never stroke the throttle with the propeller still, because gas does squirt in the carburetor, but in the absence of the engine turning over, that squirted fuel by gravity runs down, right? Because the carburetor is on the bottom of the engine, and the fuel puddles in the carburetor air box. And then if you happen to get a backfire on start, not very, pretty common, that fuel in the carburetor air box lights off and you have an engine fire. So under normal circumstances, the throttle is not a substitute for the primer. You don't sit there with the propeller still and stroke the throttle 2-3 times to get extra gas into the engine to start it. That's bad, and I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying stroke it once with the engine turning over, because internal combustion engines are really big air pumps, right? All you're doing is sucking air in through the carburetor, or the fuel that squirts out goes into that moving air and gets sucked right into the engine where you want it. So that's okay to do that, the two-handed start. But don't stroke the throttle as a substitute for the primer when the engine's really cold. Not safe. How about radios and instruments? You should set up radios on the ground. I get people come for flight tests, and we start off with the cross-country task. And they get to plan their cross-country at home, right? And so they come in and we review that and chat about it during the oral, and then we go out and start the flight portion, and we take off on the cross-country that they plan. Now, we're clearly not going all that way. It would take too long. We're just going to fly along long enough to see if they can navigate. So that's fine. So they're anxious to get airborne, and they take off without setting the radios up. Then once they get airborne, they go, oh, I got to set this course in, or I need to enter this waypoint. Two things are wrong with that. First of all, we're in the vicinity of the airport, and they ought to be looking outside for traffic, because that's where other airplanes are. But no, they're looking down here at the radios with an occasional glance outside. I'm not happy with that. Next thing they do is, because they have to fly the airplane and keep the right climb speed and try to get off on the right heading and look for traffic, and they're worried about me in the right seat, they're evaluating them, they make a mistake putting stuff in the radios, especially when it's VOR. And then they head off in the wrong direction, okay? And they're being tested. No, I don't fail them for that right away. We only fail people not when they make a mistake, if they can't correct the mistake. But still, now they've created a problem for themselves. So you avoid all of that by setting the radios up on the ground. Those of you who are instrument rated know that's one of the very first things they taught you after some basic control issues is always set your radios up to the first fix on the ground so you don't have to do it right after you take off. And people will say, yeah, well, I can't receive the VOR on the ground, though, so how can I set the radios up? Okay, of course you can't receive it unless it happens to be on the field. That's okay. Put in the frequency. You know the approximate heading where you're going. Put that in the omni-bearing selector. So you take off. When the needle comes alive, you only have to make a minor adjustment to center the needle, but you're not sitting there twizzling the thing, rotating it all the way around, going past it, coming back. Do it on the ground. Safer, eliminates errors, do that. While we're talking about VORs, I know everybody flies GPS these days, including me. But VORs are still in wide use, and the system is not going away. The FAA is shutting some of them down, but they intend to end up with about 500 of them as a backup, regional backup to GPS. So they're not going away. What course do you put in your omni-bearing selector? People come for tests, and they almost always want to put in the course that they calculated, which is affected for wind, right? They got the winds aloft forecast, and they use their E6B or their fancy electronic device, and they get a course, or ForeFlight tells them. But they get a course, but it's corrected for wind. Think about this. Wind does not blow electronic signals around in the air, right? So what you need is the magnetic course in your CDI, not the magnetic heading. When people have problems with navigation, 9 times out of 10, everything just suddenly falls into place if you match your directional gyro with your wet compass. Problems just disappear. So that's the first line of defense. If you ever have a problem with an instrument approach or lost in a cross country, don't use the L word, say temporarily disoriented when you're flying around, first thing you should do is check the directional gyro against your magnetic compass, fix it, and then start analyzing the rest of the situation. Mostly you'll find out suddenly your problems are gone. How about rudders, keeping it coordinated? So here's a new question. When do you need rudder? How many instructors are here? I'm going to do this program for CFIs tomorrow from a different perspective. There's 10 or 12 of you here. Some instructors, when they're trying to explain rudders to students, they tell them about the turn coordinator and specifically the ball, and they say, you need rudder if the ball is out. If the ball's out, step on the ball. Well, that's technically correct, but it gives the student the wrong impression. It gives the student the impression that you need rudder when the ball is out. So they wait for the ball to go out, then they step on it. Well, guess what? If the ball is out, you already screwed up. You already made a mistake. You didn't use the rudder when it needed to be used. So a better way to tell it is you need rudder whenever the control wheel or stick is displaced. So it should be automatic. If you turn the wheel left or displace the stick left, you should be pushing on the left rudder, not wait for the ball to go out. So that's what I teach. And I don't let people solo. You don't solo in my flight school unless you automatically use the rudders. And how do I get to check that out? A lot, because the last thing before solo is doing a whole lot of takeoffs and landings, and we're going around the pattern. They don't use the rudder to roll in, rudder to roll out. Every turn they make, I say, let's put this landing practice on hold here, and we're going down south of the field to our practice area and work on this turns and rudder control. It should be automatic. Nobody should come to me as a pilot examiner with 50 or 60 hours, and I say, would you please demonstrate a steep turn to the left? And they just crank the wheel, and they don't use any rudder at all. And the ball falls out, and then they may or may not even use the rudder, but in any case, the plane catches up, right? Some airplanes, Skyhawks, very common airplane, the airframe will catch up, and the ball will go back to the center, but not before the airplane fishtails, and everybody in the airplane's doing this. And I don't look at the ball when I'm doing a test. I'm looking outside for traffic, but I sure as heck can feel that. And it's a specific requirement in the ACS that all these turns have to be coordinated. It says so right in every task. Flies in a coordinated manner. If the ball's out, it's too late. You already messed up. So don't teach that, you CFIs. Explain to them that they need to use the rudder. Do I have that slide? No. My airplane partner, Frank, is here in the audience. I brought my own audience just in case the rest of you didn't show up. Anyway, I have a slide in another presentation where I talk a little bit about this, and his hands are in the slide. I immortalized them. Of course, you can't tell it's him. But I tell people, pretend there's an interconnect between your knee and the control wheel. You turn the wheel, pushes on your knee, causes you to push on the rudder pedal. Okay, enough about that. Short field and soft field landings. How do you get to put the airplane wherever you want to every time? And if fields are really short, you need to be able to land at the beginning, not someplace 1,000 feet down the runway like you practice as a student pilot. So in order to learn that, you have to talk about aim point and touchdown point. And guess what? They're not the same place. The touchdown point is where you'd like the wheels to touch the surface. If it's a very short runway, you'd like the wheels to touch very close to the beginning, so you have the remaining runway to stop. If there's obstacles, of course, you have to clear the obstacle first. But anyway, you want to touch down as early as possible. Okay, so you decide where you want to touch down. Then decide where you want to aim the airplane. The aim point is the place where the airplane would hit the ground if you didn't flare. Now, we know you're going to flare. I understand that. But That's where you have to aim when you're coming down final. Generally, power off, the aim point is about 150 feet before the touchdown point. If you're landing, my friend Mike Pastore here, we fly off a little airport in Chicago called Napier Aero. It's one of the aviation communities, have a lot of houses there. They have an east-west runway that's 1,600 feet long. It's not too big. We generally only use it when there's a strong wind out of the out of the east or west. But you come in over some open grassland. They call it prairie up there. You come in over the prairie, and the brush there is only about as high as these chairs you're sitting on. You got to touch down right in front of Mike's house, right where this thing starts if you want to get stopped before you run into some guy's backyard. So how do you do that? You actually have to aim out in the prairie, and that makes people uncomfortable. It's really hard to get people to aim short of the actual landing surface, but that's what you have to do. You aim short of the landing surface, you flare, you're in ground effect, the airplane floats, and it just sets down right on the runway in 15 or 20 feet from, in his case, where they start mowing. And it works perfectly. You cannot aim where you want to touch down and then flare. Oh, we just float right past that point, right? Way the heck down there. You're giving up 150 to 100 feet of runway, and if it's short, you don't have it to waste. So this concept of aim point and touchdown point further down is important. So you're coming down final. How do you tell if you're high or low with respect to your aim point? Because that's what you're aiming for initially, right? Easy. The place where the airplane would strike the ground when you're descending on final is the point on the ground that's not moving up or down in the windscreen. That's where the airplane will hit the ground. So you just put your aim point there. If you look at your aim point and it's gradually moving down in the windscreen, that means you're going to land further than that. So take a couple hundred RPM off and make that point stay fixed. Conversely, if you choose an aim point and you're headed that way and it starts edging up in the windscreen, you're going to strike the ground before you get there. Add a little power. But that's how you tell. The point that's stationary in the windscreen is where the airplane would strike the ground if you didn't flare. And if you're low, especially, you say, oh, I better add some power here. So you add some power, which makes you land a little further down. When you get back on your normal desired glide path again, don't forget to take the power back off. I see this all the time on check rides. An applicant will be low on a landing. They add power to fix it. Okay, that's the right thing to do. Thank you. But then they leave it on, and they go from being too low to way too high. So don't do that. You add power. You only leave it on long enough to correct your problem. Don't leave it on for the entire approach. Same thing in taking power off. You're a little high, take power off. Nose drops a little. When you get back down to the desired glide path, you've got to bring it back up again. What do you use for soft field approach? It's not real muddy. You won't get stuck when you land. But what if it rained yesterday or the day before and you're landing on grass and the surface is just a little soft? So you're going to do a soft field landing. Okay? Soft field approach speed is not published, right, in your POH. It's just not there. How do you determine what it is? What works for soft field landings is to fly 5 knots or 5 miles an hour. I don't care which calibration you're in at this point. 5 knots faster than the published short field speed, which is in your POH. If you just simply use 5 extra knots And that's all. Don't go any faster than that. And carry 200 RPM above flight idle all the way to touchdown. What's flight idle? It's a lot higher than where your airplane idles just sitting still on the ground. Most airplane engines sitting on the ground run somewhere around 700 RPM. But if you retard the throttle to idle all the way to the stop in flight, on final, you'll find out typical about 1,000 RPM is what it's turning. 200 RPM above that is 1,200. So set the power on final for 1,200. Or if you were high and you came all the way to idle, as you come into the flare, increase the power, just 200 RPM. If you go up 300 or 400, the airplane won't land. It'll just fly down the runway and eat a lot of it. You don't want that. Just 200 RPM cushions the arrival. When the wheels touch the ground, pull the 200 RPM off to make sure it stays on the ground. You can do nice soft field landings every time you should do that. Well, okay. Here's 8 more quick hits and we'll be done here. When you're going to turn, how do you know, especially if you're going to turn 90 degrees, like in the pattern, right? You take off, you're going to practice some landings. Take off, climb straight out, get 400 or 500 feet in the air, going to make a 90-degree left turn. Where's that? Well, you could look at the compass, that's true, but it'd be a whole lot nicer since you're in an airport environment to be looking outside instead of staring at your compass. You might memorize at your home field, you might say, well, I turn till I face that barn or whatever, but you know you go to another airport, there's no barn there. The easiest thing to do, you should look in the direction of turn anyway, right? Because you don't want to turn and there be another airplane right there. So just look down the wing. The wing points at something. It points at a tree, a building, a hill, a tower. It points at something. Look at that point, remember the point, then look back to the front and initiate the turn because you need to look out the front to set the appropriate bang. Now the airplane's going to come around. When you come around and you see that point that you looked at, just roll out. You turn 90 degrees. So just look down the wing and pick a point. Works real well. I sometimes see applicants, they'll turn their head to look to initiate a turn, and then they don't look back. They look, they don't see anybody, and then they roll into the bank, and you have no idea what bank you're going to get because they're not looking out at the horizon. They don't have any bank reference. So you need to look back to the front, set the bank, and then watch out the front as the airplane comes around. You need to lead the roll out a little bit, right? As you see the point come into view, maybe within 10 degrees of it, make a nice smooth roll out, you'll be headed directly for it. I see people, they saw the ailerons. It'd be a little, especially if the day's just a little bumpy. I'm not talking about bad turbulence, but just a little. And every little bump, they're going like this. Their hands almost a blur. I can't imagine after they fly for an hour on a cross country what their wrist must feel like. You know, it's going to fall off their arm. And I go, what are you doing? I'm just trying to take care of these bumps here. I say, would you let me fly for a minute? And they're relieved. They go, oh, sure. I say, okay, I've got the airplane. So I initially put my hand on the wheel, they let go, and I'm flying. And then I just put that hand in my lap. And the airplane isn't doing a thing differently than when they were saw in the airplane. You can't fix every little bump. In fact, if you try, you get out of time with the bumps and you make it worse. You're way better off to let the airplane fly and just fix trends. Sure, if the right wing gets down, the airplane starts to turn right, you'll need to fix that. That's fine. But trying to compensate for each little movement of the airplane is just a futile thing, and you're working your fanny off for nothing. Let it fly. How about slips? Nobody likes slips, except us tail dragger pilots. We like to slip. But Boy, do I see ugly slips on check rides. People don't like them. They just don't like the feeling of having all this rudder one way and the wing down. And so they'll put in the rudder and drop the wing because they know they have to do that. Then it feels weird. So they can't stand to hold the rudder, so they release it about halfway. And the nose whips. And then they go, oh crap, I'm supposed to be slipping. They put it back in, the nose goes the other way. So we're going down final, and the airplane's going like this. It's hard. Easiest way to do a slip, first of all, drop the wing into the wind. Whichever side the wind is coming from on final, drop that wing and push the rudder all the way to the floor the opposite way, and just hold it there. Pitch for your normal approach speed. However you normally approach, use that speed. That would be just great. And otherwise, maintain runway alignment using the stick or the control wheel. Steer it like a truck. Need to go to the left, increase the bank. Then, need to go to the right, take some bank out. But at any rate, do that until you get close enough to the ground, however close you're comfortable with or whatever is necessary. Then release the rudder pressure, level the wings, land the airplane. If there's a crosswind, leave the wing down a little bit, point the nose straight down the runway, and you're good. Those of us that fly small light tail draggers, we slip very close to the ground if we need to, if we're high, and then that's just great. Other people that go below 100 feet with the wing down, they're panic stricken. It's fine. Okay. What are we down to? Buckling your safety belts. I see people struggle with safety belts. They get in the airplane, and generally the seats are back, right? So they sit down in the seat, they find their safety belts, buckle them up, put on the shoulder harness, pull the buckles tight, then they go to set the seat. Well, the seat won't go forward because the belts are tight. So now they have to loosen the belt. Now they loosen them. So they get all that done, but now they can't reach the door. And it's like, geez, you've been flying the airplane for how many hours and you haven't figured out this door and safety belt thing yet? The easiest thing to do is get in the airplane, and while the door is still open, where you have elbow room, reach back here and get your safety belts from wherever the last person threw them, buckle them up. Leave them very loose. Don't even think about snugging them up, but they're buckled. You have control of them. Move the seat forward to flight position. Oh, no, then close the door, because it's easier to close the door with the seats back, because you can reach. So you close the door. Now, move the seat forward. The seat goes forward wherever you want it, because your safety belts aren't tight yet. Now, once it's where you'd like it to be, pull your lap belt tight first. For some reason, people like to pull down on their shoulder harnesses first, but then all they do is they pull their lap belt up off their lap. But have you ever been in an airliner? They say buckle your safety belt low and tight. There's a reason for that. If you have an accident and your lap belt isn't tight, you go down and out from under your lap safety belt. Now you might almost might as well not have safety belts. So always pull the lap belt tight first, then adjust the shoulder harness so it's comfortable. And then you're in there and you're not fiddling around. Shutting the door. This is Frank's arm right here. Frank, there's your arm. At the flying club at Trimfor Air, where Mike is, they had enough people slamming the door on the Skyhawk that they ripped the door handle right off the door. You know, the door sill where Frank's hand is in this picture is a whole lot stronger part of the airplane than those flimsy door handle things that Cessna gave you. So your best bet is to open the window, hold on to the door, and shut it. Now, it's not necessary to slam it from 2 feet out. It just beats the heck out of the door. It works better if you pull the door slowly to within 3 or 4 inches, and then just maybe give it a little bit of a brisk pull to get the latches to latch. And it's important to open the window because as you shut the doors, they all have rubber door seals, that last little bit, you're compressing the air inside the airplane. And no, I understand the whole cabin leaks. It's not a pressurized airplane. But it resists getting the door to shut all the way and latch. If you don't open a window, you have to slam the door harder. And slamming the door over time beats the heck out of the door. So it works better to open a window. Or in a Piper, that little vent window that swings out, hopefully you have one, open that, or it flips down rather. But open something, then shut the doors, then close the windows. And by the way, wow, if I reach down, I'm sure it gets a lot of noise. Mechanics will never lubricate your door latches, your door hinges, or your seat rollers. And you say, well, why not? I take my airplane in for annual. Why don't they do this? You know, and stuff needs lubricating. Mechanics are supposed to know that. You know why? It's not in the list. There's the manufacturers, Piper or Cessna or whoever, has a list. Here, you do this on the annual. It's a big list. That's why your annual's expensive. Nowhere in there does it say lubricate the door hinges or the seat rollers. So they don't do it. And even if you ask your mechanic, then it's too much. Yeah, I'll get around to that for you. And they don't do it. So it's one of the things that you just have to do yourself. And you'll be a whole lot happier because your seats will actually go back and forth easily. Taxi with a control wheel back in reasonably calm wind. If it's real windy, you have to hold the control wheel correctly on the ground to compensate for the wind so the airplane doesn't get flipped over while you're taxiing it. I understand that. But anything, you know, below about 8 knots, it doesn't matter. Taxi with a control wheel back. It relieves the pressure on the nose wheel. Don't think it has any effect at taxi speed. Next time you're taxiing the airplane, you try it. You start with the control wheel all the way forward and then pull it back to the stops. While you're taxiing, nose will come up. The elevator's effective at low speeds. Not effective enough to drag the tail or anything, but it does move. And if you relieve the pressure on the nose wheel, then you don't have to change those expensive seals in that strut, right? There's a couple of O-rings, a backing ring. You have to take the scissors apart. It takes the mechanic about an hour to do it. The little kit you have to buy itself is something like $80. It's a $200 repair. If you taxi with the control wheel back, you don't have to do it as often. And while you're at it, bring yourself a clean cloth and wipe all that crud off the chrome part of your nose strut. Then the crud doesn't grind away your O-rings and make it leak. Leave your beacon on. Since March of 1996, the beacon has to be on anytime the engine is running, right? So why ever shut it off? It's got to be on day and night. The beacons aren't electronic, so a transient surge won't hurt them. We don't start or stop the airplane engine with the radios on, right? Because we don't want to spike them. But the beacon doesn't care. One of the neat things is if you leave your beacon on, it does go off when you shut the master switch off. If you hop out of the airplane and somehow manage to forget to shut your master switch on, I know nobody ever did that, right? Anyway, as you're walking away from the airplane, you'll see the beacon flashing and you go back and shut it off. Or somebody else will tell you, hey, I think you left your master on there. You know, airplane's behind you, you don't see it. Is that embarrassing? Yeah, it's embarrassing. But you know what? It's better than having your battery go dead. At least somebody saw it and told you. If you get in the habit of leaving your beacon on, which we do with our flight school airplane, but we rent the airplane to pilots who learned to fly a very long time ago, and they turn stuff off from force of habit. So you do have to check to make sure it's actually on. You can't count on it. I think this is the last one. You're saved. Just one thing, IFR. When I learned to fly on instruments back in the 70s, one of the things they specifically taught us at what is now American Flyers, if there's any old school people here, this was ATE of New York. They merged with American Flyers. But anyway, they specifically taught us that if you make a late turn or ATC gives you a late turn and you're trying to intercept a course like a localizer, it's okay to increase the bank a little bit above standard rate in order to improve the intercept. It's called hurrying the turn. Now, I'm not standing up here on this stage advocating aerobatics on instruments, but you know, if a standard rate turn might be 15 or 18 degrees, it's okay. A bank might be okay to go to 25 degrees to make an intercept work right. You won't lose control of the airplane. So don't hesitate to hurry the turn if you really need to do that flying IFR. So, I was right. It was the last slide. So that's the end of the formal part of my program. We do have about 15 minutes left here that we could use for questions. These gentlemen have a microphone, and like I said, they're recording this program, and so use the mic.
Okay, I had a question. What kind of lubricant do you use on the seats?
I'm not sure that mic is on.
Test. What
Oh,
kind
it
of
is?
lubricant
Okay.
do you use on
Yeah.
the seats?
Yeah, I can hear Ann. She's one of my imported audience. Okay, so a good general purpose lubricant is LPS2. It's a spray lubricant. It comes in 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3. 1 is really, really light. It's kind of like WD-40, and it doesn't last very long. LPS2 is an oily substance that lasts a while, and the 3 stuff is like really gooey. So I'm a big fan of LPS2. Who's next?
Your slide. Are your slides available?
Yes, if you send me an email, my address is up there, right? If you send me an email and ask for the slides, then I'll respond and attach my slides to the response.
Hey, thanks a lot. Any specific weigh-in on the new ACS standard for slow flight?
I don't want to talk about that. No, I'll talk about it briefly, because I have to evaluate. I'd wimp out if I wouldn't answer, right? So here's the deal. The new guidance is the FAA says that they don't want people to get in the habit of flying around with some kind of stall indicator activated, be it a light or a stall horn or whatever. So they've said they want slow flight demonstrated at a speed just above where the stall warning would activate. Now, I'm not so mean that if an applicant, I ask them to demonstrate slow flight, and they inadvertently make the stall horn squeak, I go, oh, you failed, you blew the stall horn. No, come on. I look over and say, hey, you're not supposed to activate the stall horn. Why don't you go up a couple knots? You know, we have to be reasonable here. So that's my take on it.
I guess this is more of a safety reminder since everybody knows this, but just from personal experience. A lot of times you'll get a clearance to taxi and they'll say stand by for your numbers. So you start to taxi and then the tower calls you, gives you your squawk code, your departure frequency. You're leaning over putting in your departure frequencies and the numbers, and you're still taxiing. Don't do it.
Okay, so I think what you're trying to get at is they tell us when we're taxiing around we shouldn't be distracted trying to do several things at once, shouldn't be setting up radios, shouldn't be copying clearances. You should be paying attention to where you're taxiing and not running into things. Okay, so I guess my answer to that is, how about some common sense here? Some people are pretty good at remembering clearances. I know a guy I used to work for in Seymour could just remember and repeat complicated clearances. I'm not that good. I can do a simple clearance in my head and repeat it back without having to stop and write stuff down. So it depends on your level of comfort with it, but you know, you can always tell air traffic control that they need to stand by. That's not just for them when they're busy, that's for you as a pilot. So if you're not comfortable writing down a clearance while you're taxiing, you can say to him, sir, I'd like to call you back, get that clearance when I get over here by the run-up area. Right? So make it work for you. Who else?
Question over here, Larry.
Yeah, you gave your recommendation for starting a warm engine
Yeah.
using the accelerator pump. What about a fuel-injected engine?
Doesn't work for them. That's a simple answer. Fuel injection engines are sometimes harder to start, and they're temperamental, and different ones work different ways. I used to fly a Cessna 182 that was fuel injected. A friend of mine had a glass cockpit, one didn't fly it much, used to beg me to use his airplane. Not too shabby. But at any rate, we finally learned in the end that his fuel injected engine, you could just simply start like it was when it was hot. You just simply started it like it was a carbureted Cessna Skyhawk, and it would light up every time. So, but I can't help you with that.
Yeah, one over here, Larry. You gave some RPM numbers for the ultimate classic Lycoming Continental world, and some of us fly little planes with high revs and gear-driven props, Rotax planes. You have any way of correcting for that in the recommendations you've made?
I don't think I understand the question. How about, could you reword that, Your Honor?
You gave RPM numbers for various things. Do it at this RPM, do it at this RPM. I'm assuming that's for a Lycoming engine airplane.
Yeah, Lycoming or Continental direct drive, where the propeller is bolted to the crank.
Right.
Okay, so you're talking about where I said add a couple hundred RPM if you're doing a soft field landing.
Correct.
You're going to have to figure out what it is for your airplane. I don't have much experience. I am a light sport examiner, so I am occasionally involved with Rotax engines, but not a lot. So I don't know the answer to your question. And when you don't know, best plan is to fess up.
Okay, last chance for questions. We got another one right behind you, Jay.
It's not really a question so much as a comment. You know, you mentioned leaning on taxi, and I make my students do that. But what I have them do is increase the RPM to 1200 and lean it till it just starts to drop. And it's pretty much leaned properly then for 1000. If you try to do it at 1000, oftentimes they'll kill the engine because they aren't fast enough to push the mixture back or turn the mixture back in. So that's just a suggestion.
Okay, you're talking about for ground leaning. Yeah. Okay. So whatever works, but the point is you should ground lean because most engines run very rich at idle, and if you don't lean and if you don't keep the RPM up, then the tetraethyl lead in the fuel, it's 100 low lead, right? It's not unleaded. The tetraethyl lead plates out as metallic lead, and if you ever look in spark plugs, you see these little balls of lead when they take them out of your engine. That's what that is, and that's what you're trying to prevent.
All right, thank you, Larry.
Warren, I have one thing I'd like
yes,
to add.
Go ahead.
This is just something that I have to throw in with Larry's stuff with regarding to seat belts, okay? A lot of you folks fly vintage aircraft. And we, of course, as FAST team personnel, do a lot of accident investigation. We're working with the crews on accident stuff, so we're talking about seat belts, adjustment, moving, things of that nature. If you're taking a look at your seat belts in your aircraft and they're showing signs of fading, maybe getting tattered, or they're not quite looking like they did in 1935 when they installed them in the aircraft, okay, the cheapest investment you can make in your life is going to be a new set of belts. For some reason, over the last 2 years, we've had 4 fatalities in North Dakota with ag operators that have literally torn through their seat belts. So we're really starting to become more aware of what's going on with these belts. The belts were still attached, but it ripped completely through them. Yeah, so exactly. So my concern for you folks is I want to keep you safe, like we all do. And so take a look at your seat belts. Take a good look at them. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to amplify. I've done a program here 2 years ago where I talked about safety belts, and if your safety belts are older than 10 years old, even if they look good, they haven't been slammed in the door 19 times, or 1900 times, and they're all chewed up, that's pretty obvious. But sunlight and just the elements deteriorates the strength. So even safety belts that look okay can be significantly weakened. And no, you can't break them by yanking on them, but your body can in an 8G deceleration. If they're 10 years old on the annual inspection, take them out of their airplane, put them in a box, send them to one of the folks that refurbish them. Jim mentioned Wag Aero. They're as good as any, and they're pretty reasonable. Have them re-webbed. They use your hardware. It's less than $100 a seat. It's well worth it.
Thank
Our
you all.
airplane,
Thank you.
Frank and I had ours re-webbed. We put our money where our mouth is.
Larry, I'd like to present you with a certificate for helping us out today. And how about a hand for Larry Bothe?
Thank you. Thank you.